I've heard so many times that continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora are too different and cannot form coalitions or work together. But is that really the case? In this video, which is part 2 of our 3-part series on unity in the global Pan-African world, I want to dispel that idea. More specifically, I will look at both history and the present time to demonstrate that connections between the African continent and the Pan-African diaspora are still very, very strong. There you have it. Let's fasten our seatbelts, let's dive in, and let's get to work. Hello family, welcome to AfriKili, where we build bridges between Africa and the global Pan-African diaspora by focusing on 3 pillars: Pan-African history, Pan-African business, and Pan-African political action. As a reminder, the word AfriKili is a contraction of the words Africa and Akili, which means intelligence in Swahili, the most spoken African language in Africa. So AfriKili stands for African intelligence. If you followed our previous video, which was part 1 of our 3-part series on unity in the global Pan-African world, we looked at the powerful impacts of global Pan-African coalitions that would include Black people from Africa, the United States of America, the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and other regions of the world. Well, in today's video, which is the second part of our 3-part series, we will look at existing connections between continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora. We'll specifically see how, despite the appearances, the bond were never completely severed. We look at countless instances where Black people in Africa and people of African descent in the diaspora have successfully joined forces to target common causes. Now, to start things off, let's understand that the concept of unity in the Pan-African world is central to advancing our AfriKili mission of building bridges between Africa and the global Pan-African diaspora in order to once and for all change the image and the destiny of Black communities around the world. But ultimately, AfriKili's vision will not materialize unless continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora finally join hands. See, by unifying and building coalitions around our common African ancestry is a source of strength and enlightenment. Now, before starting, I want to mention something. As I was researching this topic, it was very striking to see how the last 3 presidents of the United States of America received drastically different reaction when they embraced their foreign ancestry. So here I'm referring to Joe Biden, who's the 46th president of the United States, who's of Irish descent, Irish ancestry. We have Donald Trump, the 45th president, who's of German ancestry, and Barack Obama, the 44th president of the United States, who is of Kenyan ancestry. Let's start with Joe Biden. Back in April 2023, he went on a 3-day visit to his ancestral homeland of Ireland. While he was visiting the country, he went to the presidential residence in Dublin, and he wrote a very popular Irish poem in the guest book. He said that the poem happens to be his granddad's favorite poem, and the poem simply says, "Your feet will bring you where your heart is." Now, clearly, this poem implied that Joe Biden's heart resides in Ireland. Not only that, after he came back to the United States, President Biden continued expressing his love for Ireland by describing his trip as being, I quote here, deeply personal and a return to his home. Now, as touching as it was to see President Biden reconnect with his roots, the public reactions to his ancestral connection was diametrically opposed to that of former President Barack Obama, whose father was from Kenya in East Africa. On one end, you have President Biden, who was able to overtly express his love for his foreign ancestral home without generating any uproar. In contrast, the mere association of President Barack Obama to his father's homeland of Kenya brought up a plethora of criticism. During President Barack Obama's presidential campaign and his residency in the White House, you had loudmouths in the media and a segment of the extreme right that went as far as questioning the authenticity of his US citizenship. I remember some critics going as far as requesting that he be returned to his country of Kenya. Now, let's also remember that Donald Trump took advantage of this racist sentiment against Barack Obama. And I remember him manipulating his audience by claiming that, and he claimed that for several years, that he possessed the, quote, birth certificate that would confirm suspicions about Barack Obama. Eventually, he had no choice but to recant his false claims after he decided to launch his presidential campaign. Nevertheless, the point is that this is ironic, considering that President Trump's followers often praise his grandfather's European German origin, and they often use it as a symbol of his authentic, hardworking nature. Now, beyond this, I would say, digression in the world of politics, there is a sentiment that Americans of European descent can freely display their ancestral roots from Germany, Poland, Italy, Greece, Scandinavian countries, you name it. There are so many countless festivals around the United States that celebrate European heritages. You have festivals such as Oktoberfest, St. Patrick's Day, etc. However, when it comes to expressing African ancestry outside of the African continent and highlighting connections to Africa, there seems to be less enthusiasm and acceptance. Unfortunately, this sentiment can also be observed within some Black communities around the world. Continental Africans, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and other Black communities in the global Pan-African diaspora are often influenced by negative stereotypes of each other. As a result, they often struggle to express their shared ancestry and bonds. The negative stereotypes can really prevent interaction between different Black communities and create an appearance of unsurmountable differences. However, it is worth noting that these stereotypes and differences can really be surmounted. There is ample evidence that connections to Africa and collaboration between different Pan-African communities is not only possible, but has existed in previous generations and still exists in our current generation. Currently, there is an increasing number of celebrities, such as Oprah Winfrey, Louis K. Jr., Beyonce, Stevie Wonder, Mike Tyson, and so many others, that have proudly reconnected with their African roots. Now, often they will publicize or they will publicly disclose the results of their ancestry DNA test and really strive to elevate the element of the African culture or different African cultures. Beyond reconnecting with their African roots, there are countless other people of African descent that are relocating to Africa. I previously recorded 3 podcasts in a series exploring this Black exit movement, also known as the Blackseat movement. There are also several present-day activists that are connecting issues in the global Pan-African world. For example, there is the, I would say, prominent Pan-Africanist called Kwame Seba, who was born in France from Beninese parents from Benin. He's wrote multiple books, and his latest, called The Philosophy of Fundamental Pan-Africanity, in which he proposes solutions to help advance the cause of Afro-descendant people across the world. And over the years, he has worked to organize the French-speaking Black communities in Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Another name that really comes to my mind is Ayo Tometi, who was born in the United States from Nigerian immigrants. Now, you might know her as the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movements, the BLM movement, which gained recognition in the 2020s. And the BLM movement really became associated with organizing protests, denouncing police brutalities after the murder of the African-American George Floyd, who was brutally murdered by a police officer in Minnesota in 2020. Now, if we turn our heads back to history, there are people like the Jamaican Marcus Mosiah Garvey, or Marcus Garvey Jr., who's often cited as the main figure in the Pan-African diaspora who actively worked to create a tangible connection between the African continent and people of African descent around the world. Through his New York City-based organization, which was called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, it is undeniable that Marcus Garvey helped restore a sense of African pride in the diaspora and a desire to connect with the continent. However, beyond Marcus Garvey, there are many more names such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and even Malcom X that are just as relevant to this topic. Now, these three names are often associated with the African American struggle against racial inequality in the United States. But surprisingly, both continental Africans and African Americans are often unaware that these three individuals also expressed a deep connection to the African continent and even longed for a stronger unity between people of African descent. Let's take a deeper look at their connection to the African continent. Let's start with W.E.B. Du Bois. Back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, was a very prominent and illustrious African American who was born in 1868 in Massachusetts. He was the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard University in 1909, and he was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. In addition to his strong militancy for the eradication of racial injustices in the United States, he was also a proponent of building a free and strong Africa so that the continent would help champion the cause of Black people around the world. Towards the end of his life, he decided to emigrate to Ghana in West Africa and was one of the leaders of a group of Afro-American expatriates that later included people like the poet Maya Angelou and many others. So W.E. Du Bois was treated like a king by the Ghanaian president Kwame Nkrumah, and he was given all the support he needed to continue advancing his intellectual work. He ended up dying and was buried in Ghana in 1963. Now let's look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who drew inspiration and felt reinvigorated from his experiences in West Africa. Back in 1957, when Ghana became the first African country to gain independence from colonial powers, the Prime Minister and soon-to-be President Kwame Nkrumah invited Dr. Martin Luther King to attend the independence ceremony. Before traveling to Africa, Dr. King was becoming disillusioned by the extreme violence that was inflicted on African Americans after the Montgomery bus boycott successfully concluded. However, what he witnessed in Africa renewed his hope that white supremacy would eventually be toppled, as he described in his Birth of a New Nation sermon. It is not often publicized that the first time Dr. King publicly proclaimed his "free at last" cry of freedom, he was actually referring to Africa. Like many civil rights activists that were influenced by the decolonization movement in Africa, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was linking the fight against colonialism in Africa to the African American fight against segregation. Now let's look at Malcom X, who longed for Pan-Africanism and unity among African heritage peoples. Malcom X's father was a leader in the Marcus Garvey UNIA Back to Africa movement. So as a child, Malcom X often attended meetings where his father and other UNIA members discussed the different messages of Marcus Garvey, and they often talked about the African promised land. Unfortunately, after his father's assassination, Malcom X became a troubled child and ended up going to prison where he lost all connections to Africa. However, after he came out of prison and traveled to Africa, his love for the continent re-emerged, and he remained connected to the continent until his assassination in February 1965. As evidence of Malcom X's desire for more unity and collaboration between Africa, here are a couple of quotes from his book titled The Autobiography of Malcom X that was written by Alex Haley. Now, the first quote here came from a speech that Malcom X gave in Nigeria at the Ibadan University Trenchard Hall in May 1964. This is a quote in chapter 18 of the book, in which Malcom X says, "I said that physically we Afro-Americans might remain in America, fighting our constitutional rights, but that philosophically and culturally We Afro-Americans badly needed to return to Africa and to develop a working unity in the framework of Pan-Africanism. So he is very clear in his statement. Now, the second quote came from a speech he gave while visiting Ghana, where several African-American expatriates, such as Maya Angelou, lived. So in this quote, he says, "I said that the 22 million Afro-Americans in the United States could become for Africa a great positive force, while in turn, the African nations could and should exert positive force at the diplomatic levels against America's racial discrimination." Can you imagine what can happen, what could happen, and what would certainly happen if all of these African heritage peoples ever realize their blood bonds, and if they ever realize they all have a common goal, if they ever unite? Malcom X understood that continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora would benefit tremendously and overcome racial injustice against African heritage peoples if they work together within Pan-Africanist frameworks. Let's look at Kwame Nkrumah. Interestingly, the three prominent Afro-American names that I just mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, were all hosted in Africa by Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana after the country gained independence. Now, this is not surprising, considering that Kwame Nkrumah studied and lived in the United States for 10 years before returning to Ghana and becoming one of Pan-Africanism's biggest champions. While in the United States of America, he was intricately linked to the civil rights movement and the struggle against racial inequality. His American experience influenced his unrelenting determination to free Africa from all forms of colonialism and advance the idea of Pan-Africanism. Kwame Nkrumah really believed that continental Africans and people of African descent around the world should come together and join their efforts. He believed that unity was the only way to build a powerful political and economic African continent, while at the same time eliminating racial discriminations against Afro-descendant people outside of Africa. Now, obviously, as the first African country to free itself from colonial powers and gain independence, Ghana was a natural attraction for Afro-American and people of African descent across the world. However, other African countries also attracted Afro-descendants from outside the continent. Yet countries such as Guinea, Algeria, and Tanzania that ended up being the theater of successful collaborations between continental Africans and expatriates from the global Pan-African diaspora. One such example is that of the Guyanese-Jamaican guerrilla intellectual Dr. Walter Rodney. After completing his graduate studies in London, he decided to relocate to the East African nation of Tanzania, and that was 6 years after the country gained its independence. In Tanzania, he was welcomed by the socialist president Julius Kambarage Nyerere. Now, it was in Tanzania that Dr. Rodney finished his magnum opus called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In his work, he argued that European colonialism had not just derailed Africa's natural development, but also led to the continent's underdevelopment. While he was in Tanzania, he also influenced the creation of the Dar es Salaam School of Intellectual Inquiry, a school that was focusing on understanding how to successfully eradicate imperialism and successfully navigate decolonization. Now, all the names I have mentioned in this video are just a minuscule fraction of the thousands of prominent figures that have played a key role in publicly advancing a message of unity and collaboration between continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora. There are so many other influential names, such as the South African artist Miriam Makeba, or the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist Stokely Carmichael, or the Trinidadian lawyer and organizer of the first Pan-African conference in London, Mr. Henry Sylvester Williams. There's also the African-American poet and civil rights activist Maya Angelou, You also have the African American, former Union soldier, historian, and the denunciator of the horrors that were committed by King Leopold II in the Belgian Congo, George Washington Williams, just to name a few. As I'm concluding part 2 of my 3-part series on the strong connections between continental Africans and the Pan-African diaspora in America, Europe, the Caribbean, and the rest of the world, I would like to reiterate the importance of this topic to AfriKili's mission. Pan-African communities cannot establish the successful coalitions we seek and eradicate structural racial biases against people of African descent if their interactions are guided by inaccurate stereotypes and they don't systematically seek to learn their common history. In part 1 of this series, I made the case for uniting and building powerful coalitions by shifting our approach from highlighting our differences to focusing on our similar shared experiences. In this video, part 2 of the series, I hope that I have dispelled the idea that continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora cannot effectively collaborate or form coalitions to target common causes. Through the examples that I mentioned, it is evident that connections between the African continent and its global Pan-African diaspora are strong and were never completely severed. In our next video, the 3rd and final part of this series, I will explore how continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora can concretely build coalitions and enhance their respective conditions. Ultimately, as I'm recording this 3-part series, I hope to highlight the necessity and opportunities for continental Africans and the global Pan-African diaspora to overcome their differences and focus on their similarities. We need to unify and build coalitions designed to improve all of our conditions. Let's also never lose sight that the AfriKili movement and the platform isn't about complaining, accusing, or blaming, but advancing. So before closing, I would really like to thank you for supporting us and also remind you that you can read our blog online on our website, www.afrikili.com, where you can also enter your email address so that all the latest installment of our blog and newsletters can be directly delivered to your mailbox. You can also find us on different social media platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Finally, if you like our video content, please make sure to click the like button, share the video, and subscribe to this channel. I will close with a quote from Nelson Madiba Mandela, the former political giant, the anti-apartheid revolutionary, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and the first Black president of South Africa. In his quote, he said, "Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. AfriKili Nation, let's be that great generation." Until next time, peace be with you. Asante Sana. Let's get to work. AfriKili, African intelligence to build bridges between Africa and the global Pan-African diaspora. Thank you very much.